beaten daily by her mother, until a quiet rancher took the Apache woman to a life she never expected. She was born in a small, dusty Apache village that lay tucked away between hills and wide-open plains. The village was quiet most of the time, except for the sounds of children playing, animals wandering, and the occasional wind whistling through the dry grasses. From the very beginning, her life was not easy. Her mother, who should have been her protector, was strict in a way that often turned cruel. There were days when the girl did not understand why simple mistakes, like spilling water or forgetting a chore, would make her mother shout or strike her. The girl learned early that the world could be harsh, even when it was supposed to be safe. Her father had left when she was very young, leaving her mother to raise her alone. Her mother's anger often seemed like it had no beginning and no end. She would lash out over small things, as if the world itself had betrayed her. Sometimes the girl would wake in the middle of the night to hear her mother muttering in anger about things the girl had never done. The fear settled in her chest like a heavy stone, making her small body tense at every sound. Even the laughter of other children made her jump, because she feared it might turn into anger soon. The girl's days were long and filled with chores. She had to fetch water from the distant river, collect firewood, clean the small home, and prepare meals. Every task she completed had to meet her mother's impossible standards. A dish washed too slowly could bring a sharp scolding. A bundle of firewood that was not stacked neatly enough could end in a strike. The girl began to move quietly through life, careful not to make a sound, careful not to breathe too loudly, careful not to exist in a way that might draw her mother's wrath. She learned to anticipate the mood of the day, to tiptoe around invisible rules, and to shrink herself to avoid trouble. Despite the harshness of her home, the girl had moments of escape. She found small sanctuaries in the world around her. There was a narrow path through the hills where the wind felt gentle and the grass brushed softly against her legs. She would often slip away for a few minutes, just to breathe and to feel that she belonged somewhere outside the house. She watched the birds in the sky, imagined their freedom, and wondered what it might feel like to soar above the land without fear. She would sometimes whisper to herself stories of a life where no one hit her, where no one shouted, and where she could simply be a child. Neighbors and distant relatives occasionally noticed her suffering, but in a small, tight-knit community, people often hesitated to intervene in family matters. The girl learned to hide her pain from others, smiling when required and speaking only when spoken to. But the kindness of strangers, when it came, made a lasting impression. A neighbor might hand her a piece of bread or offer a gentle word when her mother wasn't looking. These small gestures became precious treasures in her memory, tiny sparks of hope that whispered to her that not all people were cruel. School was no easier than home. The village had a small, one-room schoolhouse where children of all ages learned together. Teachers tried their best, but resources were scarce. The girl often arrived with little sleep, her body tense from fear, and her mind distracted by the worries of what awaited her at home. Still, she was bright and curious. When she could focus, she absorbed knowledge eagerly, writing letters she dreamed of sending to a world she could barely imagine. But she had to be careful not to draw attention. Speaking too loudly or asking too many questions could bring her mother's fury, which she sometimes felt looming even when she was at school. As she grew older, the punishments became harsher. Small mistakes turned into major punishments, and her mother's anger became more unpredictable. Sometimes the girl would wake in the night to sudden shouts and hurried footsteps. She would hide under her blankets, hugging herself tightly, wishing for someone to rescue her, wishing for a life that seemed only possible in dreams. She learned to endure silently, understanding that survival meant being quiet, being invisible, and never trusting fully. Even in this life of fear, she discovered a strength she did not know she had. When her mother's anger raged, she would retreat to her thoughts, reminding herself that one day she might find safety and peace. She imagined a place where she could work with animals, walk through fields, and speak without trembling. These dreams were fragile and secret, but they were hers. They gave her a sense of hope that nothing else could. The village itself offered lessons in resilience. She observed the elders, the hunters, and the women who managed households, taking in their stories and small victories. They carried their own burdens, but did not let them destroy their spirits. She admired their quiet courage and imagined carrying a similar strength within herself, even though fear often made her doubt she could ever achieve it. By the time she reached her teenage years, the girl had developed a careful, quiet personality. She did not argue or rebel, because she had learned the consequences were too severe. Instead, she became an observer, watching the world around her with cautious curiosity. She noticed patterns in human behavior, learned to read moods, and became skilled at predicting when danger might strike. Her mother's anger had shaped her in harsh ways, but it had also sharpened her instincts for survival. Yet, even as the days passed in this unyielding routine, there was a flicker of something new each time she dared to dream. She began to think of the wider world beyond the village. She wondered what lay beyond the hills and plains she had always known. Perhaps there were kind people somewhere. Perhaps there were lives lived without fear. Perhaps there were places where she could breathe freely. These thoughts were dangerous, because dreaming too openly might provoke anger, but she held on to them tightly, nurturing them as one would protect a fragile seedling in winter. The girl's connection to nature became her secret refuge. She would often rise before dawn, slipping quietly to watch the sun paint the sky with colors she had no words for. She listened to the rustle of leaves, the calls of birds, and the whispers of the wind. In these moments, she felt a tiny liberation, as if the world outside her home recognized her quietly, letting her exist without punishment. She learned to carry the calm of these moments into her day, using them as shields against the harshness that awaited her at home. Though each day was a test of endurance, the girl's heart held on to the possibility of a better life. She began to make small plans, imagining one day leaving the village, seeking work, or finding a place where she could live without fear. The idea seemed impossible at times, almost like a dream too fragile to hold, but it was enough to keep her moving forward. The knowledge that a different life might exist gave her courage, however small, to keep surviving. By the time she was nearly an adult, she had endured years of abuse, but she had also grown in ways her mother could not understand. She had learned patience, caution, observation, and resilience. She had learned to dream secretly, and she had learned that hope could exist even in the harshest conditions. While her mother saw only a child to control, the girl had quietly become a young woman with the beginnings of strength, courage, and determination, qualities that would one day allow her to change her destiny entirely. And so, though the days were still filled with fear, pain, and uncertainty, the girl's inner world grew rich with imagination, hope, and quiet courage. She was ready, unknowingly, for a life beyond the fear, a life that might one day offer kindness, freedom, and a chance to truly belong. The story of her childhood, filled with trials and shadows, was also the story of the first sparks of resilience and hope that would guide her toward a future she had yet to see, but one she would not only survive, she would embrace. By the time the young woman reached her late teens, life at home had become unbearable. Every day felt like a battle for survival. The small acts of kindness she had experienced in her childhood, like a neighbor's soft words or a piece of bread shared in secret, now felt like distant memories. The weight of constant fear pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She could no longer imagine living her whole life under the shadow of her mother's anger. She knew she had to leave, even though the thought of running alone into the unknown terrified her. One cold winter morning, she quietly packed a small bundle of clothes, a few pieces of dried food, and a simple knife she had saved for emergencies. The sky was gray and snow had begun to fall lightly, coating the ground with a thin, sparkling layer. She looked back at the small, worn house she had called home, feeling a mixture of fear, sadness, and determination. She had no plan, no destination, and no promises, but she knew that staying meant certain misery, and leaving offered at least a chance at freedom. She left before dawn, moving carefully through the village. The quiet streets were empty, and the soft crunch of snow under her feet seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. She avoided the main paths, slipping between hills and trees to stay out of sight. Every shadow made her heart race. Every sound made her stop and listen. She had learned from years of fear that caution could save her life. The winter air was cold, and her thin clothes did little to protect her from the wind. Still, she pressed on, driven by a hope that somewhere beyond the hills, life could be different. As the hours passed, the landscape changed. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and the trees grew taller and thicker. She had no map, no guide, only her instincts and the faint memory of direction she had overheard from travelers passing through her village. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her limbs, but she refused to stop for long. Every pause felt like a risk, and the thought of being found or forced to return home was unbearable. Her mind stayed sharp, scanning the horizon for signs of shelter, water, or danger. On the second day of her journey, she came across a small, remote ranch. Smoke rose from a chimney, curling into the gray sky, and the sound of animals, horses and cows, reached her ears. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this place could offer safety. She hesitated at the edge of the property, unsure whether to approach. Her life had taught her that trusting strangers could be dangerous, but her hunger, cold, and exhaustion pushed her forward. She stepped cautiously onto the property, keeping to the shadows and moving quietly. The rancher was a quiet man who had lived alone for many years. He was known in the nearby settlements for his calm nature and fair dealings. When he saw the young woman, he noticed her trembling hands, pale face, and weary eyes. She did not speak at first, only looked at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Instead, he offered a simple greeting, his voice calm and steady. He did not ask why she was there or demand explanations. He simply extended a hand of kindness, a gesture that had been almost foreign to her entire life. She hesitated for a long moment, then took a step closer. The warmth from the small fire near the barn and the gentle tone of the rancher gave her a sense of safety she had never known. He handed her a blanket and some warm food. As she ate, she kept her eyes down, unused to such kindness, unsure if it might turn into anger at any moment. But nothing happened. The rancher did not shout, did not scold. He only watched quietly, giving her the space to rest and regain her strength. Over the next few days, she stayed at the ranch, gradually learning the rhythm of the place. She helped with simple tasks at first, feeding chickens, gathering firewood, and cleaning the small barn. The rancher gave her instructions patiently, never raising his voice, and he allowed her to work at her own pace. Every day, she felt a little more at ease, a little less afraid of making mistakes. She began to see that life could be different, that not all adults were harsh or cruel, and that safety was possible in a world that had long seemed dangerous. At night, she would sit near the fire in the rancher's cabin, listening to the quiet crackle of flames and the low moans of the wind outside. She remembered the long nights of fear at home, and she felt an unfamiliar sense of peace, For the first time in years, she could close her eyes without expecting pain to come in the dark. She began to talk quietly to the rancher, asking questions about the land, the animals, and the simple life of the ranch. He answered patiently, never rushing her, and never making her feel foolish for asking. The rancher's kindness did not come with expectations. He never demanded anything in return, never tried to control her, and never judged her for her past. This was new to her. She had grown up in a world where every act of kindness was conditional, where trust was punished, and where love was often disguised as fear. The rancher's simple gestures, sharing food, offering a place to sleep, and speaking calmly, began to teach her a different kind of life, one based on respect, patience, and care. Slowly, she began to regain confidence. She learned to handle animals carefully, to repair fences, and to manage simple farm tasks that had once seemed impossible. Each small success filled her with a sense of pride. She realized she could do things for herself, that she could make decisions, and that she could contribute to the life around her. The harsh lessons of her childhood had made her cautious, but now those same lessons helped her navigate her new life wisely. Despite the warmth and safety, fears still lingered. Memories of her mother's anger and abuse surfaced at unexpected times. Loud voices or sudden movements would startle her. She often woke in the night, sweating and trembling, as the old fear clawed at her mind. But the rancher never judged her for these moments. He would offer quiet reassurance, a gentle presence, and patience, allowing her to confront her fear at her own pace. Slowly, she learned that fear did not have to control her, and that trust could be built one small step at a time. In those first weeks, she also began to dream again. She imagined a life where she could walk without fear, speak without trembling, and make choices for herself. She thought about learning new skills, exploring the world beyond the ranch, and perhaps one day helping others who had suffered as she had. These thoughts were fragile like early sprouts in a frozen field, but they gave her hope. The rancher's quiet guidance had opened a door she had long believed was closed forever. One day, while walking along the edge of the property, she realized just how far she had come. She was no longer the terrified, shrinking girl who had left her village. She carried herself with a quiet strength, and though fear still existed, it no longer dominated her. She had survived alone in the wilderness. She had found shelter with a stranger, and she had begun to build a new life. Each small step forward was a victory, a sign that she could overcome even the deepest wounds of her past. The rancher did not push her, but his presence was steady and grounding. He had become a silent protector, a guide, and a witness to her transformation. He respected her space, allowed her to grow at her own pace, and offered support without demanding anything in return. For the first time, she experienced life without punishment, without constant fear, and without the feeling that she was never enough. The quiet rancher had become the first person to show her that safety and kindness were possible, and that she could belong somewhere. As the days turned into weeks, she began to imagine a future. She wondered what life might hold beyond the ranch, what skills she could learn, and how she could live with independence and dignity. The girl who had once believed that she was powerless now began to see possibilities. She realized that the world was not only cruel and frightening, it could also be gentle, patient, and full of opportunities she had never dared to imagine. And so, on that quiet ranch surrounded by hills and open skies, the young woman began a transformation. She was no longer only defined by the pain of her past. She was learning to live, to hope, and to dream. The rancher's quiet presence, his patience, and his unwavering kindness gave her a foundation she had never known. For the first time in her life, she began to believe that she could have a life of her own choosing, a life filled with freedom, respect, and perhaps even happiness. Life on the ranch began to feel like something she had only imagined in her secret dreams. Each day she awoke to the soft light of the rising sun, breathing in the cold, crisp air and listening to the gentle sounds of animals stirring in the barns. The rancher would be there, already moving through his daily tasks, calm and steady as ever. She admired him quietly, noticing the way he handled his work with patience and care, never rushing, never raising his voice. There was something about his calm presence that made her feel safe in a way she had never known. She started taking on more responsibilities. Feeding the chickens and tending the goats had become simple routines she could handle with confidence. Mornings were spent in quiet labor, repairing fences, gathering firewood, or helping in the garden. At first, the work had felt exhausting and unfamiliar, but day by day, she grew stronger. Each task completed gave her a sense of pride. No one yelled at her for small mistakes, and slowly she began to trust herself. She discovered that she could accomplish things when she put her mind and heart into them. This realization was new and thrilling. The rancher observed her quietly, always offering guidance when she needed it, but never stepping in unless she asked. He corrected her gently, showing her the proper way to mend fences or care for animals. But his corrections were never harsh. She had spent so long in a world where mistakes brought punishment that this new approach surprised her at first. Slowly, she began to believe that people could be patient and kind without expecting anything in return. This understanding began to change her, like water softening the soil of a dry field. Their relationship was built on small, quiet moments. Some days they would sit outside after the work was done, watching the sun dip below the hills. The rancher rarely spoke unless she asked a question, yet his calm presence was enough to make her feel secure. She began sharing small stories of her past, careful not to speak of her deepest pain all at once. He listened attentively, never judging, never interrupting, only acknowledging her words with quiet understanding. For the first time she felt truly heard, and it gave her courage to open her heart slowly. She also began to explore the land more confidently. She learned to ride the horses, guiding them through open fields, feeling the wind rush past her as she gained control. She helped in the barns, cleaning stalls and feeding animals, growing familiar with every sound and smell of the ranch. The simple rhythm of the days became comforting. For the first time, she experienced a life where she could work hard, see the results of her labor, and know she was valued for her contributions. This realization was a powerful shift from the life she had left behind. With each passing week, her confidence grew. She began to take small steps on her own, venturing further into the hills, exploring the forests nearby, and even helping repair fences without direction. She discovered a new sense of independence and self-reliance that had been buried beneath years of fear and obedience. She began to realize that she could survive and thrive without fear of punishment. These small victories slowly built her courage and resilience, reinforcing the sense that her life could truly be different. Yet her past still lingered, in subtle ways. Memories of her mother's anger, her cruel words, and the fear that had filled her childhood sometimes surfaced in moments of quiet. A raised voice, a sudden movement, or even a memory triggered a wave of panic or sadness. But the rancher's patient presence allowed her to face these feelings. He never forced her to confront her past, never demanded explanations, and never judged her for her reactions. She began to see that healing did not mean forgetting. It meant learning to move forward despite the pain. She also started thinking about the future in ways she never had before. She imagined learning new skills, exploring beyond the ranch, and one day helping others who had experienced hardship. These thoughts were tentative at first, like fragile buds on a winter tree, but they slowly grew stronger. She began to understand that she had the right to hope, to dream, and to plan for herself. For the first time, the idea of living a life she chose, instead of one imposed on her by fear, seemed possible. One of the most important lessons she learned on the ranch was trust. She had spent years in a world where trusting someone meant being hurt. But here, she learned that trust could be safe. She trusted the rancher to protect her, to guide her, and to respect her choices. She trusted herself to make decisions, to act independently, and to solve problems. Each act of trust, no matter how small, was a victory over the fear that had dominated her life for so long. Her relationship with the rancher became a quiet partnership. She admired his knowledge of the land and animals, and he admired her determination and intelligence. He allowed her to contribute ideas, to take initiative, and to make mistakes without punishment. This mutual respect created a foundation of strength and stability she had never known. She began to feel that she was not alone in the world, that she had someone by her side who would not hurt her, who would not demand, and who would guide her patiently. As the seasons changed, so did she. The snow of winter melted into the green growth of spring, and she noticed the change within herself as clearly as she noticed the flowers blooming. She moved with more confidence, spoke with more clarity, and faced each day with a quiet courage that surprised even her. The girl who had fled her village in fear was now a young woman capable of hard work, thoughtful decisions, and steady resolve. She had begun to transform her pain into strength, her fear into careful courage, and her past into lessons that guided her forward. She also began to see the world around her with new eyes. She appreciated the simple beauty of the landscape, the quiet rhythm of farm life, and the gentle gestures of care between humans and animals. She realized that life could be full of beauty and kindness, even in simple everyday moments. Each day she noticed something new: a bird nesting in a tree, a flower blooming, or the way the sun set behind the hills. These small observations became a source of joy, a quiet reminder that the world could be gentle. The rancher, too, saw the change in her. He noticed how she handled animals with care, how she approached tasks with confidence, and how she began to smile more easily. But he never praised her excessively or made her feel dependent. Instead, he gave her space to recognize her own achievements. Slowly, she internalized the understanding that her value was not determined by someone else's approval, but by her own efforts, choices, and growth. Over time, she began to think of herself differently. She was no longer only the frightened girl who had been beaten and controlled. She was a capable, thoughtful, and growing young woman. She had learned that life could be hard, but it could also be kind. She had learned that trust was not a weakness, but a bridge to connection. She had learned that safety, patience, and respect could exist in the world, even if she had never known them before. The transformation was not sudden. It came slowly, day by day, task by task, conversation by conversation. But it was real. She could feel it in her body, in her mind, and in her heart. She began to believe that her life was no longer determined solely by the pain of her past, but by the choices she made and the guidance she had received. She began to imagine a life beyond the ranch, one where she could make her own decisions, explore her own path, and create a future filled with possibilities. In the quiet evenings, when the work was done and the animals were settled, she often sat near the fire with the rancher. Sometimes she spoke about her dreams. Other times she simply listened as he shared stories about the land, the animals, or his own past. These moments of connection, calm and shared silence, reinforced the sense of safety and belonging she had never known. She began to understand that life could be built on patience, trust, and mutual respect, not fear and punishment. And so, as the weeks turned into months, the young woman grew into herself. She carried the lessons of her childhood, the carefulness, the observation, and the resilience, but she transformed them into strength, skill, and quiet courage. The rancher's guidance had been gentle but firm, patient but steady, giving her the space to grow at her own pace. She was no longer merely surviving. She was beginning to live, to hope, and to dream. The girl who had arrived at the ranch trembling and fearful had become a young woman capable of handling the challenges of life, aware of her own strength and ready to face the world beyond the hills. She had discovered that transformation was possible, that trust could be safe, and that kindness could exist even in a world that had once seemed cruel. The rancher had given her more than shelter. He had given her a path to a new life, a life that was slowly becoming her own. The quiet peace she had found on the ranch was not meant to last forever. One morning, as the young woman carried water from the stream to the barn, she noticed a figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the property. Her heart tightened immediately. The figure's stance, the sharp gaze, and the way the wind caught their coat made her stomach twist with dread. She froze, her memories of her mother's harshness rushing back like a cold wave. Every lesson she had learned in fear came alive. This could be the moment she had run from all those years ago. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to run, but she knew she could not leave the animals unattended. Her body shook as she returned to the rancher's cabin, carrying the fear that had once controlled her every step. She saw the rancher outside, calmly mending a fence. He noticed her distress immediately, pausing to ask what had happened. She struggled to speak. Her voice caught in her throat, and finally managed to whisper that someone was watching the property. The rancher's calm presence was steady and without judgment. He simply nodded and prepared to help her face the situation. Together they approached the edge of the property. The figure turned out to be her mother. The sight of her mother, older and hardened, filled the young woman with a mix of anger, fear, and unresolved pain. Her mother's voice carried across the field, demanding that she return home immediately. The young woman felt her heart pound, memories of past abuse overwhelming her. The fear she had carried for years resurfaced, threatening to undo the courage she had built on the ranch. The rancher stayed close, silent but ready. His calm presence reminded her that she was not alone, that she had support and strength beyond what she had ever known. He did not step in to argue or fight. Instead, he allowed her to find her own voice, giving her the space to confront the fear that had defined her life for so long. This alone gave her a sense of power she had never felt as a child, the ability to face a person who had caused her pain without being paralyzed by fear. At first, her words trembled. She spoke quietly, explaining that she had found a life she could live with dignity and safety, a life she could not return from the way she had been treated. Her mother's response was harsh, filled with anger and disbelief. She tried to shame her, to remind her of obedience and duty. But this time, the young woman did not shrink. She took a deep breath and continued, speaking more firmly, telling her mother that the world had changed for her, that she had learned to stand on her own, and that she would not be controlled by fear any longer. The confrontation was not easy. Memories of past abuse clashed with the strength she had gained, and for a moment she felt the old panic rising, threatening to consume her. But she held on to the calm that the rancher had taught her. She focused on the present, on the safety of the ranch, and on the life she had worked so hard to build. Each word she spoke, though shaky at first, became stronger as she realized that her life no longer belonged to her mother, but to herself. Her mother's anger grew, but the young woman stood her ground. She reminded herself of the months she had spent on the ranch, the lessons she had learned, the strength she had discovered, and the trust she had built in herself. With each passing moment, her fear began to lessen. She realized that fear did not need to control her. It could exist, but it could also be met with courage, preparation, and clarity. For the first time, she faced someone who had hurt her and did not let that person dominate her spirit. The rancher remained silent, observing but not interfering. His presence was a shield, not a crutch. He allowed her to take the lead in her own confrontation, giving her the power to choose her words, her actions, and her stance. The young woman felt a profound sense of empowerment. She understood that she was no longer the frightened girl who ran silently through the snow. She had a life, a home, and a strength that could not be taken away by threats or anger. As the conversation continued, her mother grew frustrated. She realized that the young woman was no longer the obedient child she had controlled for years. The girl who had endured beatings, fear, and harsh words was now a confident, capable woman who had chosen a life of her own making. Her mother's voice faltered at times, as if even she understood that the power she once held was gone. The young woman felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief for the freedom she had gained, sorrow for the years lost to fear and pain. The rancher finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. He told her mother that the young woman had found safety and dignity, and that she would not be forced back into a life of fear. He did not shout or threaten. He simply stated the truth, and in doing so, he reinforced the young woman's own strength. She realized that courage was not about fighting with anger, but about standing firm, speaking clearly, and trusting herself. The rancher's words were not just support. They were a lesson in dignity and calm power. After a tense conversation, her mother left, shouting one last time but unable to change anything. The young woman watched her retreating figure, a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside her. She felt relief, exhaustion, and even a sense of closure. The confrontation had been terrifying, but it had also been liberating. She had faced the embodiment of her past fear and emerged intact, stronger, and more confident than ever before. Once her mother was gone, she turned to the rancher, tears welling in her eyes. She realized that this life she had found, the quiet mornings, the work she could manage, the trust she could give and receive, was real, and that it had been possible because of his patient guidance. He did not need to take credit for her growth, but she understood that the space he had given her to grow, to learn, and to heal had made this confrontation possible. Without his calm presence, she might have faltered, might have been crushed under the weight of her past. In the days following the confrontation, life returned to its quiet rhythm on the ranch. The young woman continued her daily work with renewed confidence. She handled animals, repaired fences, and cared for the land with a sense of pride she had never known before. The fear that had once ruled her life was no longer constant. She had learned that fear could exist without controlling her, and that courage was built in moments of calm, patience, and choice. She also began to think about her future with greater clarity. The confrontation had been a turning point, a moment that showed her that she could face the world, confront the past, and still move forward. She imagined a life filled with opportunities, a life where she could explore beyond the ranch, help others in need, and continue to grow into the woman she wanted to be. The possibilities seemed endless now, and each day on the ranch reinforced that life could be built on kindness, respect, and personal strength. The rancher noticed the change in her, too. He saw how she moved with confidence, spoke with clarity, and approached her work with determination. He offered guidance when needed, but allowed her to take the lead in her own growth. Together they had faced the challenge of her past, and together they had emerged stronger. The young woman realized that she was no longer dependent on anyone for her strength. She had discovered it within herself. Even in quiet moments, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the fearful child beaten at home to the young woman standing confidently on the ranch, she recognized the power of resilience, patience, and trust. She understood that life could be difficult and that fear could return unexpectedly. But she also knew that she had the tools to face it. She had learned to rely on herself, to trust wisely, and to embrace life with a courage born of experience. By the time the sun set behind the hills, casting golden light across the ranch, she felt a profound sense of peace. The confrontation with her mother had been terrifying, but it had been necessary. It had proven to her that the life she had chosen, the life she had built with patience, care, and quiet effort, was real and worth protecting. She was no longer running from fear. She was living with courage. The days that followed were filled with quiet triumphs. She helped in the barns, tended the garden, and worked with the animals with growing skill and confidence. She began to teach herself new skills, experimenting with small projects on the ranch and feeling the joy of accomplishment. Her laughter returned in small doses, a sound she had not heard from herself in years. Life on the ranch had become a place not just of safety, but of growth, discovery, and joy. And so, the turning point of her life had arrived. She had confronted the darkest part of her past and faced it with strength. Guided by the patient presence of the rancher, she had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. She had learned that trust could exist safely, and that life could be rebuilt with patience, effort, and kindness. Most importantly, she had learned that she was capable of shaping her own destiny, free from the control and cruelty that had defined her childhood. The young woman's life on the ranch had become something she had once only dreamed about. Each morning she woke to the crisp air, the soft light spilling across the hills, and the gentle sounds of animals stirring. She moved through her daily tasks with confidence, feeding the animals, tending the garden, and helping repair fences. The work was hard, but it was rewarding, and every day reminded her that she could live a life filled with purpose, safety, and dignity. She had discovered a strength inside herself that she had never known as a child. Her mornings often began with the quiet rhythm of the land. She would gather water from the stream, collect firewood, and check on the animals, moving with ease and careful attention. The rancher watched her quietly from a distance, his presence a constant but unobtrusive support. He had never forced her to rely on him, but he had guided her patiently, letting her learn and grow at her own pace. Now she could handle many of the ranch's tasks on her own, and she felt a pride that came not from praise, but from knowing she was capable. She also began to explore her surroundings more fully. Walking through the hills and forests near the ranch, she had learned to read the signs of the land, to anticipate the behavior of the animals, and to notice small details in nature that once might have gone unnoticed. The wind, the birds, and the rustle of leaves became companions in her life, quiet reminders of the freedom she had earned. She began to feel a connection to the land, a sense of belonging she had never known in her childhood. Her confidence in herself grew each day. She no longer trembled at sudden movements or loud voices, and she spoke with a steady, clear voice when she needed to. She could make decisions independently, solve problems on her own, and handle unexpected challenges without panic. The girl who had once been beaten daily, who had hidden in fear at home, was now a young woman capable of navigating life with courage and intelligence. Her transformation was complete, though it had come slowly, step by step, through patience, effort, and careful guidance. The rancher remained an important part of her life, But their relationship had evolved. He was no longer just a protector. He was a teacher, a companion, and a witness to her growth. He had shown her that kindness could exist without expectation, that trust could be safe, and that a person could support another without controlling them. She respected him deeply, not out of fear or dependence, but out of gratitude and recognition for the guidance he had provided. She also began to think about the future in ways she had never dared to before. The freedom she had found on the ranch allowed her to imagine a life beyond the hills, a life in which she could make her own choices, pursue her interests, and explore new possibilities. She considered learning new skills, visiting nearby towns, and perhaps even helping others who had faced hardship as she had. Each idea felt exciting and possible, a testament to the strength and courage she had developed over the months. One afternoon, as she walked along a ridge overlooking the ranch, she reflected on how far she had come. She thought about the frightened child who had run from home, trembling and alone, and the young woman who now stood there, steady and confident. The transformation was remarkable. She had faced her fears, confronted her past, and embraced a life she had never expected. The journey had not been easy, but each struggle had strengthened her, each small victory building the foundation for the life she now lived. Her life on the ranch also gave her a sense of peace she had never known. The quiet mornings, the rhythm of work, and the companionship of the rancher created an environment in which she could heal completely. She no longer felt the constant shadow of fear that had haunted her childhood. Instead, she felt safety, security, and the ability to plan her life according to her own choices. Each day brought new lessons and new joys, reinforcing the sense that she was capable of creating her own destiny. She also began to connect more deeply with the animals on the ranch. She cared for the horses, feeding them, brushing their coats, and riding through the open fields. She tended the goats and chickens, learning their habits and needs, and she found satisfaction in watching them thrive under her care. The animals became more than work responsibilities. They were companions, offering quiet understanding and loyalty that strengthened her sense of connection to the world. Over time, she began to teach herself new skills. She experimented with small projects, like fixing broken tools, planting new crops, and learning to cook with the ingredients grown on the ranch. Each project brought a sense of accomplishment and independence. She realized that she could provide for herself and contribute meaningfully to the life of the ranch. The lessons she had learned from her childhood, patience, observation, and resilience, now served her in a positive way, helping her succeed rather than holding her back. Her evenings were often quiet and reflective. She would sit by the fire, sometimes with the rancher, sometimes alone, watching the sky darken and the stars appear. These moments allowed her to consider her journey, the struggles she had faced, the growth she had achieved, and the possibilities that lay ahead. She felt gratitude for the life she had built and for the freedom she had earned. She also felt a deep sense of pride, knowing that she had transformed her fear into strength, her pain into courage, and her dreams into reality. The young woman began to understand that life was not defined by the hardships she had endured, but by the choices she made and the strength she cultivated. She no longer felt trapped by her past, nor did she allow it to dictate her future. She had learned that she could face challenges, overcome obstacles, and create a life filled with dignity, safety, and joy. Each day on the ranch was a testament to her resilience and determination. She also began to think about giving back in her own way. She imagined helping other young women who had faced abuse or hardship, sharing the lessons she had learned about courage, trust, and resilience. She realized that her experiences, once sources of fear and pain, could now serve as tools to guide and inspire others. This thought filled her with a sense of purpose, and reinforced the value of the life she had built. Her relationship with the rancher had grown into one of mutual respect and quiet companionship. He no longer needed to guide her constantly, because she had developed her own judgment, skills, and strength. Yet his presence remained a source of comfort, a reminder that kindness and patience could exist in the world. She felt gratitude toward him, not as a crutch, but as recognition of the guidance he had offered during her transformation. As the months turned into seasons, her life continued to flourish. She became skilled in managing the ranch, handling animals, tending the land, and planning daily tasks. She grew stronger, both physically and emotionally, and her confidence inspired a sense of calm and leadership that the rancher quietly admired. She no longer feared mistakes or failure. She had learned that challenges were opportunities to grow rather than reasons to shrink. One spring morning, as she tended the garden and listened to the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, she realized that she had truly embraced the life she had never expected. The girl who had been beaten daily, who had hidden in fear, and who had run from home was gone. In her place was a young woman who had faced her fears, overcome her past, and built a life filled with safety, independence, and possibility. She felt a quiet joy, a sense of peace that came from knowing she was no longer defined by pain, but by her own choices and strength. She thought of the future with excitement rather than fear. She imagined continuing to live on the ranch, exploring the surrounding land and learning more skills. She considered new possibilities, perhaps visiting nearby towns or helping others in need. Each thought reinforced her sense of agency and the knowledge that she could shape her life according to her own values. She had discovered that her past did not limit her. It had prepared her for the strength and resilience she now possessed. And so life continued on the ranch, filled with work, quiet reflection, and steady growth. The young woman moved through her days with confidence, care, and a sense of purpose. She had transformed fear into courage, pain into strength, and a life of hardship into a life of freedom, dignity, and hope. Each day reminded her that she had the power to build her own path, to create safety and happiness, and to live a life she had never expected but fully deserved. The story of her journey, from a frightened girl beaten daily to a confident, capable young woman, was a story of resilience, trust, and transformation. She had faced the darkest parts of her past, embraced the lessons of patience and guidance, and emerged stronger than she had ever imagined. The rancher's quiet support had given her the foundation, but it was her courage, determination, and willingness to grow that had allowed her to step fully into a life of her own choosing. By the end, she understood a profound truth. Life could be difficult, and the past could leave scars, but strength, courage, and kindness could guide her to a future filled with possibility. She had survived, grown, and thrived, and now she faced each new day with hope, confidence, and the knowledge that she was capable of creating a life truly her own.